This is the beginning of a unit on probability. Now, probability is all about the likelihood that something will happen or will not happen, depending on what you're talking about. So, we use probability all the time to make decisions in our lives. Whether that's lifestyle decisions, like, am I going to be a smoker? Because that changes the probability of contracting certain illnesses. Or whether you're playing a game with friends. Should I ask for another card if I'm playing blackjack because I have a certain probability of getting the card that I need? So probability helps us make decisions, whether that's in your card game or with your lifestyle choices. So we're going to work on understanding the mathematics behind probability a little bit better in this unit. It's not a long one, so here we go. So the probability of something happening is the number of desired outcomes divided by the total number of things that could happen. Okay, so that's right over here. The number of desired outcomes divided by the number of total possible outcomes. Now, that's maybe not the clearest way to describe what's happening. So let's look at it like this. If you're rolling a die, or dice, so one die, it has 6 possible sides that it could land on. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, right? And so the number of possible outcomes when you roll a die is 6. 6 possible outcomes. If you really need to roll a 6, there's only one possible outcome that would get you a 6, right? Because on a regular die, each side is just its own number. And so there's only one way to get a 6, and that would be 1 out of 6 then. Your probability of rolling a 6 on a die is 1 out of 6. But let's say that you just need to roll an even number. Okay? So there's still 6 different outcomes possible on that die, but if you just need an even number, you could get a 2, you could get a 4, or you could get a 6. Any of those would be totally fine outcomes to get. So there's 3 possible desired outcomes. Hopefully that makes sense. There's 3 desired outcomes out of 6 total. So your probability of rolling an even number is 3 out of 6. You can make that fraction smaller. Okay, now that's going to be part of the skills that you need for this unit. We need to be able to reduce fractions when it's appropriate. So 3 out of 6 can be reduced to 1 over 2, right? Because we can take this 3 and we can divide it by 3, and we can take this 6 and we can divide it by 3. And whenever you find that the numerator, the top, and the denominator, the bottom, both can be divided by the same number, they both have the same factor, that would be, then you should do that. You should reduce it that way. So then if we do that divided by 3, we get 1 out of 2. So your probability of rolling an even number on a die is 1 out of 2, or half, or 50%. All of those would be valid ways of talking about that probability. So let's do a few other examples here. When a coin is tossed, what are the possible outcomes? One coin. It's just heads or tails, right? So heads or tails. We're just going to abbreviate it H and T. Now, when you toss 2 coins, what are all the possible outcomes? So you can get heads on one and heads on the other, or heads on one and tails on the other, or tails on the first one. You see what I mean? So we're going to diagram that out like this. So our first coin, let's just write down first coin. On our first coin, we could get heads or we could get tails. Now we're going to use a tree diagram to diagram out all of the possibilities here. And so when you roll a heads on the first coin, you now have 2 possibilities for your second coin. On the second coin now, you could get heads again, or you could get tails. Same thing if you roll tails on the first coin. You now have 2 possibilities for your second coin. You could go heads or tails. And so there are 1, 2, 3, 4 possible outcomes. And let me write these out. Your 4 possible outcomes would be heads, heads. That's the first one. Heads, tails. Second one. Tails, heads. And tails, tails. Those are the 4 possible outcomes. Now let's talk about the probabilities of certain events happening. Okay, so when 2 coins are tossed, what is the probability of getting 2 heads? So remember that we're looking at what are the desired outcomes and what are the total number of outcomes. So there are 4 total outcomes, and only one of those is heads, heads, is 2 heads. And so the probability of getting 2 heads is 1 out of 4. Okay? What's the probability of having the first coin show up heads? So if we look at our total outcomes at the end over here, we can see heads, heads, and heads, tails are the 2 outcomes that satisfy having the first coin show up heads. Okay, and so if we're looking at those final 4 outcomes, then 2 out of 4 of them are heads to start off with. And we can reduce that because both of these can be divided by 2, and so we get 1 out of 2 is having the first coin show up heads. Now, you didn't necessarily have to look at the final 4 outcomes we came up with to figure that out. You could have just looked at the first coin over here. There's only 2 outcomes for the first coin, and 1 out of 2 of those is coming up heads first. Right? So there's going to be multiple ways of thinking about this. Now, getting a head and a tail. If we look at our final 4 outcomes, getting a head and a tail would be these 2 here. Those 2 are head, tail, and tail, head. So the order has changed, but it's still the same 2 outcomes. So getting a head and a tail, there's 2 of those out of 4 possible outcomes. And again, that's the same thing as 1 out of 2. And finally, getting a head, then a tail. So that's a specific one. It's not just getting a head and a tail, it's getting a head, then a tail. And that's only this one outcome right over here, getting a head, then a tail. So there's only one possibility there. 1 out of 4 is a head, then a tail. Now let's go back and look at all of these fractions, because these probabilities can be expressed in a few different ways. So 1 out of 4 is the fraction version, but we can say that as a decimal as well. 1 divided by 4. So if you did that on your calculator, you'd get 0.25. Okay. And then we can also change that to a percent. So 0.25 as a percent, we multiply it by 100. Right? So if we take 0.25 times 100, you get 25%. So you have a 25% chance of getting 2 heads. 1 out of 4 of those things. And you can do the same thing for any of these. So 1 out of 2 is 0.5 times 100 is 50%. Same thing for the bottom one, and then, or same thing for the third one, 50% again. And then 1 out of 4 is, again, 0.25 or 25%. Any of those is a valid way of expressing a probability.